Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me for this introductory speech on polypharmacy from a clinical perspective. Apart from my affiliations with the Ghent University and the European Institute for Innovation through Health Data, which is a partner of the C3-Cloud project, I have no conflicts of interest to declare. In this 15 minutes, we will warm you up for the rest of the conference to the problem of polypharmacy in older adults. We will look at how to assess potentially inappropriate medications by using PIMS, potentially inappropriate medications, and then focus on the aspects that are covered by PIMS lists. We will dwell a little on the evidence that we have on the impact of interventions using these PIM lists, and then conclude with some take-home messages. First, the problem of polypharmacy in older adults. Very short introduction. In the developed world, 15 to 20% of the population is 65 plus, and this percentage is growing. The population is graying. Among the population of 65 plus, many of the healthy aging older adults take one or more chronic medication because they have one or more chronic condition, as said before. Of the community dwelling very old, the 80 plus, older than 80, also more than half present polymorbidity and polypharmacy, and 5 to 8% of the elderly reside in nursing homes, which is also called long-term care facilities. Most of them have polypharmacy, a medium of 8 or more chronic medications with systemic action at the same time in the same patient. And for one in two citizens, and citizen, that's you and me, the end-of-life trajectory that we're facing is going through a nursing home and die there. For half of that, that's our future. Polypharmacy is just a number, and there are many ways to define that number. The most used in the literature is the number of chronic medications with systemic action, so not the eye drops and the ointments and the gels, but medications, chronic medications with systemic action taken by one patient at a given moment in time. What is polypharmacy? Well, if the person takes 5 or more chronic medications with systemic action, then he is subjected to polypharmacy, and excessive polypharmacy is 10 or more medications in one patient at a given moment. Some statements to consider. Not all polypharmacy is bad. It might be perfectly appropriate for a patient with 4 chronic conditions to take 5 different medications. Not every patient with less than 5 medication is well treated. It might be that a patient on 4 appropriate medications for 3 known chronic conditions might have 2 or more other chronic conditions which are not treated as they should be, and that is underuse. What counts is whether each chronic condition of the patient is not left untreated, and that's called underuse, is treated with the appropriate medication, proper use, and not with inappropriate medication, and that is called misuse. We know that most guidelines are directed to one clinical condition. If a patient with multimorbidity is treated by the book for each of these clinical conditions separately, the number of medications might be high and will become a problem in itself and lead to new comorbidities and new medications. And this is an issue that C3-Cloud has been addressing preferentially. How prevalent is potentially inappropriate medication in community dwelling older adults, 80 plus, this specific section of the elderly? It's a study from 500 Belgian community dwelling patients, mean almost 85 years, predominantly women. We analyzing the prescriptions of these persons, we found that almost 60% had polypharmacy, 67% had underuse, or not treated for all their conditions, and almost 60% also misuse. And what's striking was that in 31 of these patients, all three elements were present at the same time. They had polypharmacy, there was signs of underuse, and there were signs of misuse. So caring for elderly people with multimorbidity can be compared to a very difficult equilibrium exercise where the prescriber, the pharmacist, and the nurse must work together to get the best results. And it's not easy. How will we assess potentially inappropriate prescribing? Well, we use for that explicit criterions of inappropriate prescribing, called also decision rules. And they're mostly from the form if, then, because. If a specific disease is present, for instance, because there's an ICD or SNOMED code in the record, and or a specific drug is present with an ATC code, or in the future, the PHPID, the global identifier of Unicom, then if that condition is met, then a specific inappropriate medication that is present should be stopped or reduced in dosage, or a specific appropriate medication should be started. Why? Because there is evidence for this advice, or because an expert panel said so. And for a number of these decision rules, it's still expert opinion and not a high-level evidence-based medicine. We have collected from the three most important validated current lists, the EU7, the Beers list, the stop list, the start list, stop, start together. And we collected all the explicit criteria that are mentioned in these lists and brought them together in one database for researchers to collect, to look and to use in their research. And that's about, let's say, that is what is available today from validated current lists to be computerized in decision support system. For the widespread use of these PIMs, there are some prerequisites. First of all, the data must be available. We need reliable medication and clinical data, and that means, for instance, in the nursing homes, access to the EMAR data, the nurse administration data, most of the time the only reliable source we have there, or access to well-filled, up-to-date, current patient summaries of the patient. And it should be necessary that every patient with polypharmacy has at least a well-filled patient summary. We must computerize these PIMs. We must transform them in computerized algorithms. Which doesn't mean that we still have to interpret the results in a clinical context. It is potentially inappropriate. So it's the clinician who says whether it's inappropriate or not. It must be in a multidisciplinary context, and in this case, the GP, the community pharmacist, and the attending nurse, but of course also the patient, relatives, and a lot of other people. And that needs adequate ICT support for communication of results between all these multidisciplinary actors. When we get global identification of medicinal products, brought about by the Unicom project, it will help us to have a better application implementation of these decision rules, and it will help us to internationalize the computerized decision systems so that evidence has no border. What are the aspects that are covered by potentially inappropriate medication lists? Well, the focus is on underuse, obsolete use, dangerous drugs in the elderly, where the risk and benefit balance does no longer fit. Interactions, and there are two kinds, pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic. Kinetic being drugs fighting each other, pharmacodynamic being drugs reinforcing each other, either their action or their side effects. We have experience from our research is that the pharmacodynamic interactions are not well known, underestimated, and the most important impediments to quality of life. There's also discontinuation or deprescribing from a number of drugs, well-known benzos, antipsychotics, PPIs, statins, and calcium. And what these rules can also look on, but then they become more complex. It's the compliance to complex guidelines, also multidisciplinary guidelines in very specific clinical conditions. But there it becomes really a challenge to translate these decision rules, these explicit criteria in a suitable algorithm. What is the evidence for the impact of remedial actions using PIMS lists? What were the outcomes where we looked at, the researchers looked at mortality, drug-related unplanned hospitalizations, reduction of quality of life, cognitive impairment, very important in this group, where half of them is already in dementia and some of them, others are evolving towards, lack of alertness, falls, and of course, cost of healthcare. If we look at the observational and randomized clinical trials who considered outcome, then we can say that many studies showed an impact on the process indicators, meaning that the reduction of the mean number of PIMS, but that is process indicators. And we want patient-related outcomes. Some studies showed Some studies showed association with mortality and hospitalization. Most studies show no association with falls, with very multi-causal morbidity, where drugs are only one side of the story. And most studies fail to association with quality of life yet. If we want results with interventions, multidisciplinary cooperation supported by ICT is very important. And also in nursing homes and residential facilities, the change in organizational culture is important. It takes time. And so you need also a sufficient time frame to evaluate outcome. Next. So this brings me to the take-home messages. Complex morbidity patterns and polypharmacy are the fate of many older adults, whether residing in a nursing home or a community dwelling. These are the facts of life, and we must deal with it. The patients are vulnerable, often with insufficient clinical documentation. And I think the COVID crisis has just shown that. Half of the deaths in most countries were in the nursing homes. And we discovered that we have surprisingly little clinical documentation about who these patients were, who died, why they died. It was already a big problem to make the mortality statistics, let alone to know, to have access to good clinical documentation. However, a well-filled, up-to-date current patient summary with a reliable medication list is more than enough to unleash the power of ICT-supported medication review. So there's an opportunity there. Good clinical data and ICP support will increase the efficiency of medication review, will prevent alert fatigue, and will facilitate interprofessional cooperation, and I should add, empowerment of patients and shared decision-making. Better quality of prescribing could make this vulnerable population more resilient to pandemics and may reduce pharmacodynamic interactions with impact on quality of life. However, this later statement needs more evidence. And by that, I want to close here and thank you for your attention.